In March of 2016, a cargo plane touched down on a dirt airstrip in the heart of Chad, carrying 25 animals that nobody alive in this region had seen running free in over 30 years. What happened next would take 7 more years to finish, and when it did, it would rewrite a rule that conservation science had treated as permanent. In the year 2000, the world's leading conservation authority made it official, in writing, in a global registry that almost never runs backward. This animal was extinct in the wild. Not rare, not critically low, gone. Not one individual left outside a fence or a cage anywhere on the planet. 23 years later, in December of 2023, that same authority did something it had never done before for a large mammal. It crossed the verdict out. This is the story of the 7 years in between, and the empty desert that made it possible. Picture Chad in the early 1970s, herds of scimitar-horned oryx moving across the Sahel in numbers that reached into the thousands, an animal built entirely for a landscape that kills almost everything else. A coat so pale it reflects the desert heat instead of absorbing it. Horns that sweep backward in a long, curved scimitar line, strong enough to fend off jackals, distinctive enough to end up on the country's own coat of arms. For generations, nomadic families crossing this stretch of the Sahel timed their own seasonal migrations around these herds. Following the same grazing and water patterns the oryx had already mapped out through pure instinct. An animal that can go for months without drinking water, pulling what little moisture it needs directly from the plants around it. Then came the guns, the drought, and the war. Through the 1970s, hunting for horns and meat tore through herds that had survived in this desert for thousands of years. Civil conflict spread across Chad in the early 1980s. And with it came automatic weapons in places where oryx had once faced nothing more than spears and slow pursuit. Livestock herds expanded into the same grazing corridors the oryx depended on, and the desert had less and less room left for both. A population that had numbered in the thousands collapsed to a few hundred within a single decade. By 1980, the last confirmed photograph of a wild scimitar-horned oryx was taken not in Chad, but across the border in Niger. Through the rest of that decade and into the next, sighting reports thinned out, then stopped completely. In the year 2000, the International Union for Conservation of Nature made it formal. Extinct in the wild. Of every category on the red list, this is the one that admits total defeat without quite admitting total defeat. It does not mean an animal is gone from the earth. It means an animal is gone from everywhere except the places humans built, specifically to keep the species from disappearing entirely. Zoos, breeding centers, private collections, thousands of miles from anywhere it evolved to survive. The scimitar-horned oryx still existed. It simply no longer belonged anywhere. By the time the extinction was made official, conservationists had already been working on the problem for over a decade, and in a narrow sense, they had already partly succeeded. Beginning in the mid-1980s, small groups of scimitar-horned oryx were released into large fenced reserves across 3 separate countries. Bou Hedma National Park in Tunisia took in oryx as early as 1985. Senegal followed with reserves at Guembol and Ferlo. Morocco added Souss Massa National Park in the 1990s. Inside those fences, the animals did exactly what oryx are built to do. They bred. They formed herds. They adapted to Saharan and Sahelian terrain their ancestors had known for millennia. But a fence is a fence, no matter how large the land inside it. None of those populations were ever free-ranging in the way true recovery required. The oryx were alive, and that mattered enormously. It kept genetic lines going. It proved the species could still survive on something resembling its old habitat. But it never answered the question that actually defined the crisis. Could this animal exist again on open land, with no boundary at all, the way it had for thousands of years before anyone thought to build a fence around it? Some of those fenced populations still exist today, still breeding, still genetically valuable, quietly feeding the wider recovery effort even now. They were never a failure, they were a holding pattern, an entire species kept on life support inside a scattering of fences across 3 countries, waiting for somewhere the fences could finally come down for good. Nobody had answered that larger question. Not in Tunisia, not in Morocco, not in Senegal. Whatever came next would have to happen somewhere. Those fences did not exist. It would have to happen in Chad, the country the animal had disappeared from first. The person most responsible for what happened next never lived to see it. Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the founding president of the United Arab Emirates, had spent decades of his own life fascinated by the desert wildlife of the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, building private breeding programs for Oryx and other threatened desert species long before most governments treated the idea seriously. That personal obsession became institutional policy. The Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi carried his legacy forward, and in 2008, working with the non-profit Sahara Conservation Fund, it set out to answer the question the fenced reserves never could. The real planning took years. In 2012, a workshop in Chad's capital, in N'Djamena, brought together Livestock Association leaders, government officials, and international scientists, and it secured something the earlier attempts never had: the backing of the President of Chad himself, along with formal government protection for the release area, a safeguard that mattered enormously in a country where land disputes between herders, farmers, and conservationists could easily have derailed the entire plan before a single fence post went into the ground. By 2013, the partnership was locked in. Abu Dhabi, the government of Chad, and the Sahara Conservation Fund, later joined by the Zoological Society of London, the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute, and more than 220 zoos and breeding centers scattered around the world. That last detail mattered more than it might sound like it should. Every one of those 220 institutions contributed genetic material to what became known as the World Herd, a curated population assembled in Abu Dhabi specifically to avoid the kind of narrow, inbred bottleneck that has quietly doomed other reintroduction attempts before they ever really began. The animals being prepared for Chad were not going to be the last, thin thread of a single bloodline. They were going to carry the genetic memory of a species pulled together from across the entire world, all pointed at one landscape, one reserve, and one goal. That sounded almost unreasonable at the time: 500 wild, self-sustaining oryx, roaming free in the exact country where the species had vanished first. Before a single oryx could be released, the reserve itself had to be rebuilt into something capable of holding them. The Wadi Rimeh Wadi Ashim Reserve stretches across roughly 78,000 square kilometers of central Chad, an area larger than the entire country of Scotland, with no paved roads, no permanent infrastructure, nothing but sand, scrub, and the kind of horizon that swallows a vehicle whole. Turning that emptiness into a functioning reintroduction site meant recruiting and training teams of local rangers, most of them from the same nomadic and pastoralist communities who had grown up hearing about the oryx from their own parents and grandparents, the last generation to have actually seen one alive in the country. Training covered everything from basic veterinary first aid to operating GPS tracking equipment in temperatures that regularly climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, skills nobody in this part of Chad had ever needed to learn before. Engineers and scientists built large acclimation pens where the first oryx would spend months adjusting to the heat, the forage, and each other before ever facing an open fence line. GPS satellite collars field-tested for a full month on captive herds in the United States before ever touching a wild animal were fitted so that scientists at the Smithsonian and the Zoological Society of London could track every step the herd took after release, in something close to real time, from thousands of miles away. None of it was fast. None of it was simple. The gap between the 2013 partnership agreement and the actual release stretched on for years, filled with fence lines, training sessions, and a level of coordination between a Gulf government, a Central African state, and a global network of zoos that had genuinely never been assembled around a single species before. By the time everything was finally in place, the question was no longer whether the plan was ambitious enough. It was whether the desert itself would take the animal back. On March 16, 2016, the plane lands. The doors open onto heat that presses down like a physical weight. 25 Oryx step off the aircraft and onto Chadian soil for the first time in 30 years. Disoriented, wide-eyed, their pale coats catching the light across a landscape that has not held their kind since before most of the rangers guiding them were even born. They do not run into the open desert. Not yet. They are led into the fenced acclimation pens built for exactly this moment, where they will spend the coming months relearning a terrain their species has not touched in a generation, testing the same scrub and thorn plants their ancestors once grazed on. Standing in heat, their bodies remember even if no living oryx does. Back in Abu Dhabi and Washington, scientists watched the first GPS signals arrive, small dots spreading slowly across a map of empty reserve. The first real-time proof in over 30 years that a scimitar-horned oryx is moving, on its own, across open Saharan ground. Word spreads fast through the nomadic communities scattered across the reserve. For people who grew up on stories about an animal that vanished before they were born, this is not an abstract conservation milestone. It is the return of something that belonged to this place before any of them did. That summer, as the rainy season finally softens the ground and green shoots break through the sand, the fences come down. The oryx step out into open, unbounded desert for the first time in 3 decades. Nobody knows yet whether they will survive it. The first months are not easy. Desert heat, unfamiliar predators, the simple disorientation of an open landscape after months behind fencing. All of it puts the herd at genuine risk, and for a while, nobody watching the incoming GPS data is fully certain the reintroduction will hold. Every day that passes without a mortality report feels like a small, quiet win that nobody outside the project ever hears about. If you want to know how a story like this actually plays out, and not just the version that fits in a headline, this is where it is worth staying close, because what happens over the following months changes the entire trajectory of the project. In December of 2016, 9 months after that first flight, a field team monitoring the herd confirms it. A calf, born wild, on Chadian soil, the first of its kind born free in this country in over 30 years. It is a small animal and an enormous milestone at the same time. Every fear about disorientation, about a species too institutionalized by decades in captivity to remember how to survive without help, gets quietly answered by one newborn oryx standing in the sand beside its mother. The herd is not just surviving the reintroduction, it is starting to build its next generation on its own terms. Exactly the outcome the entire 7-year plan had been built around, and one that nobody could fully guarantee until it actually happened. For the rangers who had spent years training for a species most of them had never personally seen alive, it was proof that everything, the acclimation pens, the collar data, the years of workshops in N'Djamena, had been aimed at exactly the right target. What followed was not one release, but a sustained campaign, year after year, wave after wave. In 2017, a herd of 75 more oryx arrived, in an operation now led directly by Chad's own Ministry of Environment and Fisheries, working alongside the Sahara Conservation Fund. A sign that the project was no longer something being done to Chad, but something increasingly being run by Chad itself. More releases followed in the years after that. Calves kept being born. By around 2021, the wild population inside the reserve had climbed past 400 individuals, up from the original 25. The reserve infrastructure built for the oryx did not stay limited to the oryx. In 2019, the first 15 addax antelope, a species even more critically endangered than the scimitar-horned oryx and just as well adapted to extreme desert conditions, were translocated into the same reserve. 25 more followed in 2020, and calves started appearing within the year. Also in 2020, conservationists located a small, nearly forgotten population of Dama gazelle surviving in western Chad, a population now believed to be functionally extinct in that specific area, and in 2021, 5 individuals were moved from an existing captive population into the reserve to found an entirely new breeding group. Neither of those second and third acts, the addax, the Dama gazelle, would have been financially or logistically possible without the fencing, the ranger network, and the monitoring infrastructure the Oryx program had already paid for. Wildlife managers increasingly describe this as rebuilding an entire ecosystem rather than saving one flagship species in isolation, since Oryx, addax, and Dama gazelle all once shared this same stretch of Sahelian grassland before hunting and habitat loss stripped it bare of nearly everything larger than a hare. By 2023, the numbers told a story nobody could have confidently predicted back in 2013. More than 600 scimitar-horned oryx were living wild and unconfined across the Awadi Rime Awadi Akim Reserve. More than 500 of them had been born there, in the wild, to parents who had themselves been born in captivity, thousands of miles away. 25 animals on a cargo plane had become a self-sustaining population, in under a decade, in the same empty desert that had swallowed the species whole 40 years earlier. In December of 2023, the International Union for Conservation of Nature updated its assessment of the scimitar-horned oryx. The category changed from extinct in the wild to endangered. On paper, that is a single line moving from one column to another on a spreadsheet maintained by scientists most people will never meet. In practice, it was something that had never happened before. Not for a species of this size, not anywhere in the history of the Red List's extinct in the wild category itself. The Zoological Society of London, one of the organizations that had supported the Chad program from its earliest years, runs its own global initiative built specifically around species in this exact category. Animals alive only in captivity, waiting for someone to prove they can go home. The scimitar-horned oryx became the first species from that entire initiative to be downlisted. The first real proof that the category is not automatically a life sentence. For a large mammal, anywhere in the world, this had simply never been done. For the scientists and rangers who had spent the better part of 2 decades on this single project, some of them present for that first flight back in 2016, the announcement was not an abstract line in a database. It was confirmation that years spent chasing GPS signals across empty desert had actually been worth it. 23 years, that is how long the verdict stood, from the year 2000, when the world agreed this animal no longer existed outside of captivity, to December of 2023, when the world was finally forced to admit that verdict was not as final as it had assumed. 23 years, 1 desert, 1 reserve, roughly the size of Scotland, and a herd that grew from 25 disoriented animals stepping off a cargo plane into more than 600, running wild, across the same sand that once seemed to have erased them completely. It would be easy to tell this story as being only about one animal, a single, specific comeback in a single, specific place. That misses what actually happened here. The scimitar-horned oryx was never just being tested for its own survival. It was the proof of concept for an entire method, whether a species with 0 individuals left in the wild anywhere on the planet can be deliberately, systematically rebuilt out of captivity and back into a functioning wild population, using genetics, partnership, patience, and land. Ask what actually got exported from this project, and the honest answer is not a single species. It is a repeatable formula. Assemble a genetically diverse captive population before you ever set a release date. Secure government backing at the highest level before you build a single fence. Invest in local rangers who have a personal stake in the outcome, and monitor everything, relentlessly, for years, without assuming success, just because the first flight landed safely. That formula is already being reused in the exact same reserve, on the Adax, on the Dama gazelle, and it is increasingly shaping how conservation across the wider Sahel gets planned. That is the part of this story that outlasts any single herd count. Extinction was never supposed to be reversible. In Chad, for the first time, it was. By the Zoological Society of London's own count, roughly 84 species around the world currently carry the same classification the scimitar-horned oryx held for 23 years. Extinct in the wild, alive only because humans are keeping them alive somewhere far from where they actually belong. Most of them will likely never get a program on the scale of what Abu Dhabi, Chad, and their international partners built for the Oryx. Few species attract that level of coordinated funding, government backing across 2 continents, and a 220-institution genetic pool assembled specifically to give them a real chance. But the Oryx program proved the ceiling on what is possible is considerably higher than conservation science had assumed. Researchers working on unrelated reintroduction efforts on other continents have already begun studying the Chad model directly, looking for pieces of it that might transfer to entirely different landscapes, different species, and different sets of political constraints. Every one of those 84 species carries a different set of obstacles, different politics, different habitat, different odds. What the Oryx program removed from the equation is the deepest one, the quiet assumption that once a species crosses into that category, its story is effectively over. It proved the opposite. The story can restart, decades later, in the same landscape that ended it, if the funding holds, if the partnerships hold, and if somebody is still willing to fly the first 25 animals home and wait years to find out whether the desert says yes. None of this makes the story finished either. The Sahel remains one of the more politically unstable and logistically difficult regions on Earth to operate in, and every reserve boundary that holds, every ranger patrol, every caller that keeps transmitting, is still an active effort, not a completed one. A population of 600 is a genuine recovery. It is not yet a guarantee. Endangered is not least concern. It is simply, finally, no longer extinct in the wild. Somewhere in the Awadi Rimeh Awadi Ashim Reserve tonight, a herd of scimitar-horned oryx is moving across open ground under a sky with no fence in any direction, doing something that, for 23 years, an official global registry insisted was no longer possible for their kind to do anywhere on Earth. They do not know what they proved. They do not know about the world herd, or the 220 zoos, or the workshop in N'Djamena, or the plane that landed on a dirt strip in March of 2016 carrying the first 25 of them home. They only know the desert, the sand, and each other. But because they are out there right now, alive, unconfined, breeding, the next species on that list of 84 does not have to wonder whether reversing a verdict like this one is even possible.